Well, we've come again to that time of year where our culture, perhaps so much of the world, looks towards New Year's resolutions. And as you know, we don't have generally a New Year's resolution or a New Year's sermon. We desire to have a vision sermon, some kind of an aspect of what it means to be a Christian in this world. This morning, I wanted us to look at the life of Abraham. The reality is that we stand at the beginning of 2025, but how many of us actually thought we would be here today where we are? I mean, none of us can look into the future. We don't know what's going to happen over the coming year, and the same thing last year. How many of us have had our lives changed? We've lost jobs. We've had to change houses, started a new school. Sometimes there's been joyful changes, like having children born in the church. Others, it's more sad as we have dear friends who face the limits of their mortality and are wrestling with grievous diseases. What does it mean at the beginning of this new year to live by faith? Well, again, I think there's no better example in the Old Testament than Abraham. In fact, we're going to have a sermon series on the life of Abraham after the Gospel of Mark, and it made perfect sense to start here today. Give a kind of an overview of the things. Look at the New Testament, specifically verses 8 through 10 of chapter 11, and jump into that. Abraham was the first of the patriarchs, wasn't he? He was the one who God made that first covenant relationship with, a relationship about people, about land, a covenant that really every other covenant afterwards flows out of and is built upon. He's the first person in the Bible who's ever said that he believed in God and it was credited to him as righteousness, just as Brian had read this morning. And then that importance spills over into the New Testament. We have so many references. He is the father of faith in Romans 4. He is the father of all who believe in Jesus Christ, Galatians 3. And of all of the people that are talked about in this wonderful chapter of witnesses that go before us, he is given more time, more words than anyone else. For all these reasons and for many more, it is so good for us to look at what it means to live by faith like Abraham did. Now, this is not about discerning God's will. We're talking about once we know what the will of God is. What does it mean to walk by faith? Abraham demonstrates that for us. He follows God's leading wherever it was. So he epitomizes for us what it means for us as Christians who have been saved by Jesus Christ. What does it mean for us to walk by that faith as well? What does it mean for us to be certain of the things that we can't see, to hold them so tight that no matter what storms may be brewing on the horizon, no matter what challenges we may be facing, we commit and we trust God and his promises? Now, verses 8 through 10 is just a small part of what we're told about about Abraham in chapter 11. But I want to take those verses, and we're going to see three things. We're going to see that we need to, first of all, verse 8, we need to start out in faith. Verse 9, we need to continue in faith. And then in verse 10, we need to look forward in faith. Those are the three things. So, as we start this morning, I just want us to take a look at verse 8, set out by faith. It says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. That's quite an example of faith, isn't it? God tells Abraham to pack everything up, and he does, and he just leaves. What's important, I think, for us to recognize here is Abraham didn't wait, did he? He didn't hesitate. He didn't say, well, I've got other things to do. He didn't question. And we know that because the very words he went when he was called to go, it's probably better translated while he was called. Then the inference then is while God is speaking to him, his heart is already committed to the thing that God is revealing. It's not that he goes home and thinks about it as he starts thinking and looking around, but at the very instant God tells him to do it, his mind and his will are committed to that. His heart is committed. What that tells us about Abraham is that he responded immediately. He responded promptly. It was a decisive action in the moment and was motivated by a complete and utter trust in the one who was speaking to him at that moment. When we see that in the Gospel of Mark, we saw that just a few months ago when we were looking at Jesus calling the disciples. You remember? Jesus calls them by name, and they immediately drop everything. They leave their nets, everything that they're doing, and they start following Jesus. And compare that to Luke chapter 9, where we see several people saying, well, we want to follow Jesus. We want to follow you. Tell us what to do. And Jesus says, well, follow me now. And then one man says, well, wait a minute. I need to bury my father. Another says, well, I need to go home and I need to say goodbye to my family. Each of them say they want to follow Jesus. And when they have excuses, Jesus says, there are no excuses that matter. I'm the only thing that matters. The reality is when the Lord of creation calls us, that calling captivates us. It must capture our heart, our mind. And out of that, it commands us and we obey. Faith, then, is not hesitating. It's not delaying. It trusts implicitly in God's timing. So setting out in faith, first and foremost, means following God promptly and immediately. But secondly, setting out in faith means that you trust God to cover your losses. Now, following God often means letting go of things that matter to us. Relinquishing the control or the care of those things that we hold dearly in our life. It could be family, it could be job, it could be a number of different things. And sometimes we'll even say, well, I have no idea why you want to do this, Lord. Why do you want me to do that? But that's what faith is, isn't it? It's trusting in God when we don't know what the outcome is. We don't know his plan. We trust even though we cannot see. One of the things I think we need to think about is just how radical a decision this was for Abraham. He obeyed. He wasn't a worshiper of the true God. He was a pagan just like everyone else in the city of Ur. He had a whole religious system. But when God spoke, he committed himself to this one true God. When Abraham followed God's leading, it cost him dearly. We just have to go to Genesis 12, and the verse that God has given us in his word here. It says, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Firstly, he says, leave your home, leave your country. That's the place of connection. That's the bond of place, isn't it? We live in this world. We live in a physical location. It could be the countryside. It could be the city itself. But geography plays a huge part in who we are as people. Abraham was called to leave behind Ur, probably the most sophisticated, the most wealthy, the most developed city at that time. God said, leave that all behind. Follow me into the wilderness. The only thing that's probably as hard as starting out fresh and leaving that place where we know we felt in is starting out in a new place. We start out in a place that we don't know where to go to get groceries. We don't know where to go to get our car fixed when it needs fixing and you want somebody you can rely on. All of these things are out there that we've got no markers for. We got no bearings, no compass for. And it gives us a lack of security, doesn't it? It's not easy to pick up our roots and move to another place altogether. And here's the thing, Abraham was 75 years old when God called him and he obeyed. That's a lot of living in one place, isn't it? And more than likely on the same street and perhaps even in the same house. And yet he forsook all of that to obey God, to live in a strange and unfamiliar place, a place where there was no reference signs for him to live easily, a place where by the very way he acted, he spoke, he would become a marked target for anyone who wanted to take advantage of him. But the second thing God says, I want you to leave your people. And that's the tie to a culture, isn't it? And that is a strong bond, whether we like it or not. Most of you are CBCs. They're Canadian-born Chinese. You've got these two cultures that continually interact, and that's a unique formation. Now, people in Toronto, we may be different from those who live up north. They have different understandings of political realities, of money, of all kinds of different things. But we still share in the same basic values. We still share in the same basic cultural expectations, the same hopes, the same aspirations. We share the same history, the same customs. So even though they're geographically may be different, culturally, we share the same things. And leaving your culture can be a very traumatic experience. Again, nothing is not everything is different. Nothing is the same. Not only do you not have the reference markers in your life, but you probably can't speak the language and be made known easily to speak. You have to learn a whole new way of living, of acting. And you know what? After even decades of being in that new place, in that new culture, you still will probably always feel as an outsider. Even after being 10 years in Chile, it was very easy just walking down the street to realize that you're not Chilean. We were never Canadian perfectly as people would think anymore either. But the reality is that God had called Abraham to leave his people, to leave his culture. He went and he lived amongst the Canaanites, a people that were going to be known for their hatred of God's people. A different religious system altogether, a different set of values, different language, different way of being. Thirdly, God called Abraham to leave his father's house. Oh, what a strong connection that is. Now, my family, I can't say that we're necessarily really closely related, but there are still things that we do together every year. The reality is, many of us are prepared to leave the place that we grew up. Many of us are prepared to potentially even leave the culture that we find ourselves in. If we need to move to Europe for job, for example. But how many of us struggle with losing our family? That's the tightest bond, the tightest connection there is, isn't it? We're all products of our families, for good or bad. And it's hard to separate us from that. From the people who nurtured us and looked after us and cared for us, even in our stupidity and our boneheadedness. They loved us. Family's important. It's one of the strongest bonds. So here are the three things that God tells Abraham to leave behind. He says, leave behind the place that you've grown up, leave behind your culture, leave behind your family. And Abraham did, without hesitation, without questioning, and that cost him dearly. God said, leave your country, leave your people, leave your family, your father's household. Leave all of the security, leave all of the comforts that you have known for the last 75 years behind. And it's the same thing that we read in the New Testament, isn't it? When the disciples heard the call of Christ, they dropped everything to follow him. That was the only thing that mattered. And it cost them dearly. Sometimes God calls us to leave things that we love. Sometimes God calls us to leave things that we hold dearly. We don't know in the future what that may mean, but we need to understand that that is part of the reality. There is a cost to following Christ, and that loss can be real. It hurts. There is a real cost, again, to following Jesus. But here's the thing. Even if there is a great cost, even if there is great pain, we have a wonderful truth in Mark chapter 10. Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, and with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. There's a great cost in following Jesus, in setting out on that trail of faith. But we know that there is great reward. There is more we gain in the end than we ever lost to begin with. And that's such a wonderful promise to think about, isn't it? God will cover all our losses if we set out to follow him. But you know what? I think there's lots of people who will look at those things, who will say, I don't want to leave my parents. I don't want to leave my home. And so they never set out. They're never obedient to the things that God is calling them to do. The reality is that trying to live by faith means we take risks. We trust God because we believe that the reward in the end is greater than the rewards that we have here. Setting out in faith means that we trust God to cover our losses. Now, the third thing we see here is that in verse 8, that we shouldn't expect any more information. Verse 8 tells us that Abraham obeyed God and set out, even though he didn't know where he was going. God didn't give Abraham a map. He didn't give all of the information that Abraham himself would have probably liked to have had. He simply gave him a direction, not a destination. Abraham didn't know where God was leading him, so he had no forwarding address for his family. He couldn't say, well, when I get there, then you can send some sheep on and you can help support me while I get established there. There's nothing like that. He couldn't tell his relatives where he was going to be because he didn't know where he was going to be. All Abraham knew was that God knew. God had a plan. And you know what? That was enough. That was all that mattered to him. So he sets out in faith. Now, how many of us would say, I'm going to set out on a trip this afternoon. I've got no destination in place. I don't know how long I'm going to be going for. I don't have a plan. I don't know where the gas stations are. I don't know where to find food. I don't know where the restrooms are. Who of us would say we would do that? And yet, that's exactly what Abraham did. Setting out in faith means that we don't have all the information that we think we need. We operate trusting God has a plan and that he will fill in all the details as we make our steps forward. Now, I guess you could ask, well, why God doesn't tell us all of the things that we need? Well, simply, we need to understand that if we did know everything, we wouldn't have to walk by faith, would we? And we know that's what glorifies God. Trusting in him, doing the things that glorify him, even when we can't see the results, even when we don't see the things around us, by faith, when we act, that glorifies Christ. But you know what? We may not like it, but it's also a needs-to-know basis. There are so many things in the plan of God that we don't need to know about, that are so far beyond us. God reveals what is necessary for the moment. But you know what? There's also one more thing. If we knew everything that was going to happen in 2025, would we really be eager to go forth in faith and to embrace things. Because John chapter 16, verse 12 says, Jesus is talking to the disciples. He says, I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. There are things that are going to happen in our family, in our church, that we will not be able to bear. We will groan under the pain. And if we knew now, it would be even worse. We wouldn't want to walk by faith. We wouldn't want to be obedient. We wouldn't be able to bear it. So God doesn't tell us everything as we start out on our journey. He doesn't even tell us all the things that are going to happen while we're in the journey. It is a needs-to-know, momentary thing according to his good purposes. Now, wouldn't it be great that had we set out in faith, we make this great demonstration, this great resolution, this great commitment, and then everything else falls into place? As soon as you make that first great step, everything else comes clear. All the dust settles, the mist goes away. There's no more questions. There's no more risks. Wouldn't it be nice to take that first step of faith and everything becomes, as my girls used to say when they were young, easy peasy lemon squeezy? Wouldn't that be nice? But that doesn't happen, does it? So often, even after we've made that first step, it's just as hard or harder to continue on living a life of faith, to maintaining that course, to maintain the following and the commitment. And that's why so many regular resolutions have fallen apart. And I don't know how many, if you would even dare to say at the snack time afterwards, say that, you know what, even 5 days into the new year, my resolution has totally fallen apart. Think of that commitment compared to living a life of faith, irregardless of what is happening in this world, that you put your hopes and your trust in Christ. And verse 9 says, by faith, Abraham, when he went out to live in the land of promise, did so in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. I think the first thing we need to see here is that in continuing to walk in faith, we mustn't expect instant results. It's important here to remember, God didn't give Abraham the promise of the land and the promise of everything right away at the beginning. There was a start at the beginning in chapter 12. There was additions in chapter 15. It was only after Abraham got into the land of the Canaanites that God actually said, look at the land around you. I promise this will be your inheritance to your offspring. And then again, recognize that it's to his offspring. The promise wasn't to Abraham. He didn't say, this is your land, Abraham. Seize it and take it. He says, this is the land I'm going to give your descendants. But that didn't matter to Abraham. He lived as a stranger in the land of promise. It became his home, even though he didn't have anything to claim as his own. And it turns out it was going to be a very long time, wasn't it? There's Abraham, there's Isaac, there's Joseph, there's Jacob. Wow, then we have 400 years of being in Egypt. What happens next? We have 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Only then does Joshua come and Israel come into the promised land. We're talking almost 600 years of waiting for that promise. That is a lot of walking by faith. 600 years before the promise comes to fruition. That patience, that's persevering. What it tells us is that we need to adjust our mentality, our expectations. God's got his own timetable. And even if he is leading us in a certain direction, we may never know this generation nor the next, should he tarry, what exactly that means. We live in a day when we want instant results. We get communication from around the world. We get annoyed when our double espresso, low-fat latte takes more time than it should to get to us. But God has his own timetable, doesn't he? He's working that out. And you know what? We are just a very, very small cog in that whole process. God functions on another level, doesn't he? It's the Lord. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day to the Lord. Since time began, God has been unfolding this plan of redemption, but it's according to his timetable. And you know what? No one can change that. No one can rush him. And the truth is that continuing to walk by faith means that we can't expect instant results. We have to have the long plan in our sights. It means that we must continue to walk by faith, even when nothing seems to be happening around us to confirm God's presence. It means waiting on God's timing. But notice as well, in verse 9, we mustn't get too comfortable in one place. It says Abraham lived as a stranger in a foreign land. He understood that he was a temporary resident. He had a spiritual visa and nothing else. He never settled down. He never lived in a city. He never built a house. He never made himself comfortable in the land of Canaan. Acts chapter 7, verse 5 even goes as far as to say that God did not give him an inheritance at all, not even 1 foot length of an inheritance. Abraham lived his whole life in Canaan in tents. He never set down roots anywhere. He moved as God led him. You know, God had promised Abraham that one day this land would belong to your descendants, but he didn't know when it was going to happen, and he didn't know how it was going to happen. And because of that, he remained mobile, ready to break camp, to move and to set up again wherever God led him. And in the same way, God calls us to be pilgrims in this world, aren't we? We are to pitch our tent, to hold things lightly, not covet them, to be able to release them and let them go as God calls us to move on. And that's not easy for us. I don't know about you. I like my comfort. I like things around me that give me stability. It's hard for me to drop everything at an instant's notice, to give it all up, to actually lose financially, and to follow God. We like being comforted. It's hard for us. Which of us would be prepared to do that? But the question, I think the deep question, because this may never happen to every one of us, is are we at least willing to do that? Do we have that mentality? Should God call us today, tomorrow, am I prepared to move from this city to another culture, to another place? Am I ready to give up my job? Am I ready to leave my family ties behind for being obedient to him? The reality is faith keeps us limber. It keeps us flexible, and we're ready to respond again as God leads us. Thirdly, we need to see that continuing to walk by faith means we need to camp out on God's promises. Just like Abraham camped out on the promises of God, literally in his tent. He lived as a stranger in a foreign land. But this land was his by promise. It wasn't his yet. He didn't physically have a deed to it, but God had promised it to him. So even though he lived in a tent, by faith, this was his home, the promised land. He knew that one day it would belong to his descendants, so he pitched his tent there. And what makes this trust so dramatic, so evident, so amazing to us is that when Sarah dies, what happens? He buys a small plot of land with a cave, and then he buries her there. That's her final resting spot. And then when he dies, he's buried there as well. Even more, when Isaac and Rebekah die, they're buried there. And what about Jacob? Guess where he's buried? When he dies in Egypt, they carry him for months, his dead body, to this very cave, to this small plot of land, to be buried with his forefathers. Abraham trusted so implicitly in the promise of God that the land would belong to his offspring that he bought that small piece of land. It was a spiritual down payment of faith that all of these promises are going to come true. Now, when you're following God's leading, you need to be ready to camp out on the promises of God. That they're immovable, and as long as you hold fast to them, you are likewise immovable. It means trusting God until the end. No matter what difficulties may come up, no matter how unclear the path lies ahead of you, no matter how long it may take, God is faithful. He's going to keep his promises on his timetable. And our task is simply to follow when he leads. But you know what? That's going to mean that we have a faith that must be stubborn, that must be persevering, that must be persistent, and must be patient. Waiting isn't easy, is it? Many of us are tempted never to start. Or we'll start and then we'll fall off partway through. We can start out in faith with all of the best intentions, but then as soon as things get rough, challenging, or difficult, that's it. So the question now becomes, how can we continue to follow God's leading? How do we continue on in the future following by faith? How can we be strong in our faith? In fact, how was Abraham strong to keep following God? He couldn't see the outcomes. He couldn't see the challenges, but he had an understanding that God was going to bring this all about one day. And we see this in verse 10. He was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Abraham was able to keep on following God because he was looking forward. He wasn't looking back. He wasn't looking to the sides. He wasn't looking at the present challenges. His hope, his expectation, God would fulfill all of these things. So he was ready and prepared. When it says looking, it's not a looking that is an inactive. This is a looking and a yearning forward and always being prepared that perhaps today God will fulfill that promise. Now, how do you keep on going in the midst of struggles, in the midst of doubt? Again, not by looking back, not by looking at the problems you're in. You need to look forward to the promises of God. But to do that, we need to remember again that God has his own timetable. He doesn't think like we do in days or weeks or months or even years. God thinks in eternity. Abraham lived as a stranger in a tent. He never lived in a city because he was looking for a city whose founder, whose architect, whose creator was God. He was looking for a city that was designed and built not with human hands. He was looking for the New Jerusalem. He wasn't looking for a beautiful city in Canaan and saying, oh, well, this is where I'm going to hang out now. This is where I'm going to settle down. He was looking for the kingdom of God. He was looking for heaven itself. Wherever God leads us in the world, it's only a stop in the process of our final destination, the ultimate fulfillment of the completion of the kingdom. And that means that some of the promises of God that we hold so tightly here now, we may never see in this life, but only in the life to come. What that means physically or practically is that we must, again, learn to forsake the glory, the riches, the wonder, the comfort of this world for the glory that is yet to be revealed. And we stick with it. We trust God. So what does it mean by following or walking by faith is looking into 2025? Setting out in faith, continue to walk by faith, look forward in faith. Now, again, we don't know what's going to happen in the days and the months and the year to come. There may be some amongst us who will not be here in 12 months. There may be some of us whose marriages will be on the rocks, whose children will have presented such challenges. How do we, by faith, look forward, not with a myopic, well, it's new year, everything's going to start fresh, but with a desire to walk by faith, to know that God has a plan, to engage and to follow God wherever he leads for his glory. That's the challenge this morning. And that's the challenge of Abraham that we'll come back to starting in May. Our Heavenly Father, thank you again for your word.